Welcome back to the Daily Drum on WHUR and Sirius XM Channel 141. I'm Harold Fisher. Tonight, we preview the National Black Caucus of State Legislators. There's a meeting coming up this week in D.C., and actually it is already underway. This week, hundreds of Black state lawmakers from across the country are converging on the nation's capital for their 48th annual legislative conference. Now, this comes on the heel of the 2024 elections, which marked a bittersweet time for a lot of Black elected leaders. So, how are they forging ahead? And what's on the to-do list for these 700 plus members who represent some 60 million Americans? My guests are Harold Love Jr., Tennessee State Representative and President-elect of the National Black Caucus of State Legislators, and Cherish Pryor, Indiana State lawmaker and treasurer of the National Black Caucus of State Legislators. Thank you both for having some time to engage us in this really important conversation.
Thank you for having us.
Sure thing. First and foremost, I want to share a few fast facts with you. At the state level, African American lawmakers represent about 10% of state legislators. There are 57 African American representatives and 2 African American delegates in the U.S. House of Representatives. They represent 29 states, plus the U.S. Virgin Islands and D.C. There are 4 Black U.S. senators. That number will grow to 6 in January. When you hear those figures, and I'll start with you, Representative Pryor, what comes to mind?
Again, thank you for having us.
Sure.
I'm glad to see that we are getting more legislators, African American legislators, elected at the national level. And to me, that's really important because it allows us to have more of a voice in our congressional delegations, not only in the House of Representatives, but also in the Senate as well. So that gives me some hope. Although I will say, I think that we do need more. And so I think there is certainly room for growth, even though we're getting more African American legislators, particularly in the Senate, which seems like a harder for us to do. So I'm happy about that, but it's still a lot of room for growth in that area.
Representative Love, same question. What comes to mind when you hear some of those numbers?
I think it reminds me of the fact that state level politics is going to play an important role in the upcoming year. We know that African Americans at the state level represent a huge number of constituencies. We know that we're situated right between the local governments and the federal government. And oftentimes when federal policy is pushed down to the states, we have to deal with that. And many times when local governments are trying to work their way through policy decisions, we have to then give them some guidance in that measure. And so to have the number of African Americans that we have at the state level highlights, I think, the importance of NBCSL, because it reminds the fact that this organization helps provide support and provide opportunity and tools for state lawmakers to help the constituencies.
At 10%, the national Black population is at 12%. So the percentage of representatives is about 2% lower. What does that suggest to you, Representative Love?
I think if you look historically at gerrymandering, not based upon political party, but based upon race, you will find that many times African American populations are packed into a legislative district, which means that you may have a state lawmaker that has an 80% or 90% Black population in their districts. Conversely, we also have some members of our party, of our organization, that are representing 10% of Black folks in that district. And so you have that wide swath of persons in one area. You have a very small percentage. And so it tells us that in some areas, there's still being African Americans packed into districts. And that means that the representation by Black Americans is, as you point out, 2% lower than the national average, because you have a district that is, again, 80-90% Black, but there's an opportunity for those who represent smaller Black populations to still have a voice for all African Americans. We have a legislator from Alaska. We have a legislator from Utah here in our conference today, which that the population of Black people in Alaska and Utah is not as large as it may be in Indiana or in Tennessee. But what it says to us is that people put trust in that person. And even though they don't have a huge, again, African American population, the people in that district trust these African American leaders.
Representative Pryor, talk to me a little bit about NBCSL. That is not necessarily an organization that your average Black voter may be familiar with. What is the mission of this organization?
The mission of NBCSL is really to move forward legislation for our community. Also to make sure that as African American legislators that represent many of our states, we have an opportunity to come together and work on legislation and policy that will advance in a positive way the African American community. And so this is our 48th year of our conference, and we are going to put forth resolutions that we hope that can be taken back to our communities and pass as potential legislation, but also sharing those resolutions with the various federal, state, and local government entities that can have a positive impact and change in what we do. So a lot of people may not be aware of NBCSL. However, the impact that we make is broad and it's great and it's very powerful. So the importance of our organization is critical to the well-being and advancement of our community.
Representative Love, would you say that NBCSL is similar on a state level to the Congressional Black Caucus or on Capitol Hill? Are there similarities at all there?
I do think there are similarities to be drawn because we know that our two organizations' time of existence is close in their years of working with legislators. I think at the federal level, what you have with CBC is an entity that works within those various houses and Senate chambers to make sure that policy is put forth, but also to make sure that in their conversation with federal agencies, they can advance the cause of their membership. For NBCSL, we represent an opportunity to encourage African American leaders at the state level to, again, come together and talk about how policy can be transferred from Florida to Indiana to Tennessee to Alaska to Utah that we know has had a good impact upon our communities. Oftentimes what we find as Black legislators is that policy starts someplace in some other state, it negatively impacts African Americans, and then someone else picks it up and it transfers it to another state. It may travel from Florida to Texas, to Tennessee, to Indiana, to California. NBCSL allows us to, as Representative Pryor said, to have those conversations and to talk about model legislation and resolutions that can advance our communities. And so it becomes almost a think tank or clearinghouse for members to come and get the tools that they need. Keep in mind also that many times when African Americans are elected in certain states, they may be the only African American in that state, in that House or Senate chamber. And to talk about the issues of their constituencies may be frowned upon by other members. NBCSL provides that space where they can have those conversations. We just left a conversation earlier today talking about disease and the need for African American legislators to really undergird and support the importance of that in the medical profession, so that we know that African Americans will not suffer in a negative way from not being diagnosed.
Let me ask you, because as I mentioned earlier in the program, that this conference is already underway. It started yesterday, but it's going to continue until Friday. As a matter of fact, I am going to be participating in moderating a panel on artificial intelligence, which certainly is one of the uh, cornerstones of the next, for lack of a better term, the next frontier for a lot of things, both both good and bad, going where no one has gone before. But forgive my Star Trek reference.
Sure.
But but for those who want to participate, because this is not a private event per se, it is open to the public. But Representative Love, for those who want to attend, this will be at the Capitol Hilton during the course of this week. How can they watch or attend?
For those who want to register, they can go to our website, nbcsl.org, and they can click on the link for the ALC, the Annual Legislative Conference, and they can register there, and they will get their documentation once they've completed that. If they are unable to do that, the opening plenary will be live streamed to our YouTube page. If they're unable to do those two things, they can then watch those sessions after the conference is over, again, at our YouTube page. And those are opportunities persons have to engage with the conference that way.
Mm-hmm. I did want to ask about this message about rebuilding the American dream. And from your perspective, how does NBCSL define the American dream, Representative Pryor, and does it suggest that it has collapsed or disintegrated?
Well, let me kind of answer it in this way. I think from the perspective of the African American community, the American dream really is a dream that we are still trying to realize. And to make sure that, because we have so many disparities within our community, and we're constantly trying to, even as legislators, trying to make sure that we alleviate some of those barriers. And when we talk about the American dream, generally we're talking about, a good quality education. We make sure that we have a house, that White House with the white picket fence. And so there are so many ways that there are disparities, particularly from an economic standpoint. So for the African American community, from my perspective, I would say that we still have a lot of work to do to make sure that there is equality, and justice and fairness for our community. And that includes making sure that we have an opportunity to purchase a home, and that the redlining that still occurs in a different type of way isn't occurring. To make sure that we have the quality education that our kids deserve to have, so that they can have those jobs. To make sure that our kids, when they go to apply for a job, they're not overlooked to get an interview because their main name may not be a quote unquote neutral name. And so I think the American dream for our community is still a dream that we are still trying to realize.
Interesting. Representative Love, I want you to answer that same question on the other side of the break. So please stay with us. We are going to take a very brief break, but don't forget you can hear this and every edition of the Daily Drum Insight segment via podcast on WHUR.com. The original Quiet Storm with Raheem Devon is next on WHUR. I'm Harold Fisher. This conversation continues on Sirius XM channel 141 and 96.3 HD2 in just a few seconds. Welcome back to the Daily Drum on Sirius XM channel 141. I'm Harold Fisher. We continue our discussion about the National Black Caucus of State Legislators now being held this week in Washington, D.C. We continue with my guests, Cherish Pryor, Indiana state lawmaker and treasurer of the National Black Caucus of State Legislators, and Howard Love, Tennessee state representative and president-elect of the National Black Caucus of State Legislators. Before the break, Representative Love, I was asking about how the NBCSL defines the American dream and the focus of this week's conference, which is rebuilding it. Your thoughts about that?
Well, Representative Pryor did a wonderful job addressing many of those issues. I would simply add this, that we're talking about improving access to affordable housing. We're talking about improving access to good quality health care. We're talking about situations where we have to address the criminal legal system when it talks about sentencing guidelines. We're also talking about the fact that the generation that is being born now and is being introduced to America now needs to be protected from some persons who would still try to judge them by their color, their skin, and negatively impact their pursuit of life and liberty and happiness because of the color of their skin. And this is the problem of race that the country has still needs to deal with, because we've not effectively dealt with the fact that we have in Nashville, Tennessee. 2 months ago, we had members jump out of the back of a U-Haul van with swastikas on and waving Nazi flags and harassing young Black men downtown in Nashville, Tennessee in 2024. That reminds us that we still have to address the issue of race in our country that's both in our face and sometimes is not seen apparently. And so when we're talking about rebuilding the American dream, we have to be in the public policy space to make sure that their discrimination is not involved in healthcare. Discrimination is not involved in providing access, again, to affordable homes, and also in the criminal legal system.
You mentioned that example of things that are happening, obviously, on the street. But Representative Love, you were also in office when 2 members of the Tennessee Three were expelled from the state house.
Sure.
Representatives Justin Pearson, Justin Jones, and that, I think, for a lot of people who are paying attention, really kind of still resonates with them, even though both of those representatives had very, very eloquent and powerful voices. They were still initially seen as quite powerless to remain in office, remain in the state house for simply breaking decorum. And so from the position of someone looking from the outside, a Black voter, an 18-year-old or an 88-year-old, what do you think that incident and others like it, say about the influence and power, or indeed perhaps even lack thereof, of some Black lawmakers in some states?
I think that is a prime example of why NBCSL has to exist. Imagine a scenario where they were the only 2 Black members of the General Assembly and were expelled and did not have a support system. Imagine a scenario where they did not have an NBCSL or a state level Tennessee Black Caucus that would provide support and guidance for them as they try to come back in to be members. Not denying the work of our other Democratic members, but again, this is a situation where NBCSL was birthed out of the fact that Black lawmakers in the late 60s, early 70s were fighting for personhood. They were fighting to be spoken to in the hallways. They were fighting to be respected as men and women, as elected officials. And that's why NBCSL was born, because there was no space for them to be respected and be guided and be strengthened. And so I would say to anyone who says, well, why does NBCSL still exist? And I looked at the expulsion hearings and I saw these Black young men being talked to as if they were less than elected officials. I would say to them, that's exactly why we have to have NBCSL, so that we can support persons like that who may be the only person in their state. Also persons who are fighting for justice around gun violence reform and around reproductive rights can be supported and receive opportunities to, again, grow and be strengthened among their peers. There's also the issue of HBCU funding that we need to talk about across this country. We know that states are not contributing what they should to our HBCUs by federal law. And this is also a point of departure where NBCSL has to step up and say, we're going to speak for those who may not have the voice to speak up. And that's exactly what we're doing to rebuild the American dream.
Representative Pryor, you were nodding your head. Your thoughts about what Representative Love was just sharing?
I agree with him 100%. And I want to elevate one thing that he mentioned, the Tennessee Black Legislative Caucus. In many of our states, we also have Black caucuses as well. So for Indiana, we have the Indiana Black Legislative Caucus. And so for us, when instances happen, we have our state family of legislators that is our family of support at the State House. So when we're having a bad day, when instances happen, because we had an incident in Indiana as well, we have that family of support that we can turn to that is very supportive of us. And they, in our Black caucuses on the state level, is a strong voice. And I always say in Indiana, and I would say this is probably the case for all the Black caucuses around the country, we are the conscience of the legislative body. And so we are there, even though we may not have a majority. And as a African American woman and a Democrat, I'm a super minority of a super minority of a super minority. But what we have is our voice. And people send us to the legislature to utilize our voice and to speak for them. No one can take my voice away when I'm standing up there at the podium, speaking truth to power and talking about the needs of my community. And it's not just the African American community, it's my community and my constituents. So that is what we bring to bear. People may think we're powerless, but collectively we have a lot of power.
So I want to drill down a little bit more, because I think you make a really important point. Because, for example, Maryland has a Black speaker, State Delegate Adrienne Jones. Okay, first Black woman Speaker of Maryland's House, Don Scott in Virginia, as I'm sure you know, the first Black speaker, period, in Virginia's House. Maryland, very, very blue when you talk about legislators. Virginia, blurple, is that a word?
Yeah.
But but with that said, there are people, those who would be supportive of Black legislators in the DMV may not truly have an understanding that in places like Tennessee, that in places like Indiana, that in Alabama, in Florida, in Ohio, in Missouri. I mentioned those states because I've lived in all of them. And so I have a different point of view where I understand some of the challenges that Black lawmakers on state levels have that we may not necessarily see in the DMV. So Representative Love, piggybacking on what Representative Pryor was saying, talk to me about some of the challenges that Black lawmakers face on a state level, getting even what would seem like common sense legislation through.
I'll give you a prime example. One of our model legislation seminars last year yielded a bill coming from California from one of our members there had a bill designed to specifically have an alert system for African American women who are missing because they traditionally were not looked for as much as other ethnicities. And we found that African American women were missing and kidnapped at higher rates and just were not being looked for because of the other alerts. He brought forth a legislation passed in California called the Ebony Alert. So, of course, I think it's wonderful legislation because I know we have missing African American females in Tennessee as well. In the process of writing the bill up, the reality set in that I could not get passed in Tennessee an Ebony Alert. Even though it was a good bill, I had to change the name and use a different title to do the same work. And so we found is in states like Tennessee and Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Texas, South Carolina, those states in Kentucky below the Mason-Dixon line, what we find is sometimes when you're in that double minority, it's requiring you to have more savvy to get some legislation passed. And I'm always conscious of my father's advice he gave me, who he served in the legislature from 1968 to 1994 in Tennessee. He said, Harold, if you ever get elected, you must always ask yourself this question when you're trying to get some policy made. Do you want the job done or do you want your name on it? So that means that sometimes I may have a bill that I may have to have a conversation with one of my other colleagues about them carrying it, or I may have to propose a bill that I know that they will vote down and then may change a word or two in the language and bring it up next year and pass it. The objective still has to be get the job done, help out my constituency, be smart about how I'm going to introduce policy and get it done that way. It's different when you're a Black legislator to deal with these policy issues.
Well, some people would say that's called working across the aisle or working in the same row of those of the same political party who do not necessarily look like you.
Oh, this is sometimes the opposite political party that you're having to try to figure out how to negotiate between. So for those of us who are Democrats, right, and Black, it's about navigating the waters of the Republican Party, but then also maybe navigate the waters of some Democratic members who are not Black, and trying to make sure that you maintain that balance and don't get caught up in some of the other foolishness that goes on in those chambers. But there's some things that you have to deal with that, for example, in Maryland, you don't have to deal with. You have a Black speaker, you have a Black governor, you have a sizable Black caucus. Tennessee, we have a non-Black governor, non-Black speaker, right? And a small Black caucus, but we get things done. To Representative Pryor's point, I don't think anyone should ever estimate the power of a Black caucus in their state, whether it's one member, 2, 25, or 30. We find ways to improve our communities, whether it's having a conversation with an agency and advocating for an issue, also finding out a way to get something passed that is going to help Black people, but it has to be shown to help the larger state as well. Sickle cell legislation is going to help African Americans, but we have to present it as it's going to stop the huge healthcare cost if you allow a person to see a doctor earlier rather than just the emergency room. That's the genius that you find in Black legislators navigating those spaces.
As you also may know, that as it relates to sickle cell, while yes, the majority of people who are challenged with this disease are Black people and some brown people, it also does impact a significant number of people in the Jewish community. And sometimes educating people will help get those things across the finish line. I'm not going to charge you for that information, but but one of the other things, and I think this may, and you know this, both of you, that is, I'm sure, particularly frustrating, is that often voters, particularly Black voters, if it's not a presidential election year, they're not paying attention. It may be difficult enough for them to pay attention to even who may be running for U.S. Senate or for Congress. They may not know who their representatives are, but when you start to get down into the weeds, so to speak, of local legislators, state, county commissioners, county councils, the city representatives, city councils, and the like, they don't know, they don't have an opportunity to really pay attention because life is lifing.
Yeah.
So how, Representative Pryor, do you address that in 2024 when this is an issue that was the case in 1994? You could even argue it was an issue in 1974.
The one thing that I would say is that we have to meet people where they are.
Mm-hmm.
We have to make sure that we are not continuing to do things the way we've always done it. That's certainly the easy way, and some of those things do still work. But we have to make sure that we are addressing and meeting people and getting information to people where they get their information from. I also think it's very important that we are getting them accurate information as well. There's so much information. People now generally use social media as their primary place for information.
Mm-hmm.
We have to make sure that we are in those spaces providing information to our constituents and letting them know who we are. In Indiana, there are several things that I do in my district. One thing I do is have a biweekly newsletter where I'm putting out information about things that I'm doing in my community, as well as letting people know about what is happening in our community as well. And it could also be things that's going to benefit them. The other thing that I try to do is sending out birthday certificates, letting people in my district, regardless of whether they vote every year there's an election or whether they vote every now and then, letting them know that I value them and I see them as my constituent as well. So I think the big thing for me is we have to meet people where they are. As you said, life is lifing, and we can't assume that people are going to be paying attention to the elections early on. But if we're not making sure that we're trying to meet people, it can't just be in their mailboxes. It's going to have to be on the screen and in social media outlets as well.
So, Representative Love, as you know, the work of creating laws, unless it's sexy, it's not sexy. Okay, and as a result of that, I would dare say that if a curious person said, "Let me just go on down to the State House and sit and listen to a committee hearing or debate on the floor," it would be at best confusing, at worst boring. And so, how do you re-educate people to let them know that a Representative Love is not in favor of that development or that state road that is going to be coming past your community?
Sure.
Or that this convoluted issue around funding is going to impact your quality of life, schools, etc. Because, as I said again, that stuff ain't sexy.
Sure.
I've covered it in my entire news career. I've had a chance to sit in subcommittee hearings and committee hearings and on the floor, and yet there are other people who may not necessarily have your constituents' best welfare in mind, who are sitting and they're understanding. This is a strategic thing.
Sure. So I would say this: when you look at the time that myself and Representative Pryor and other members are actually in the State House or in our offices reviewing bills, sitting in committees or on the House or Senate floor debating bills and voting on them, when you look at the amount of months that we spend in that space, it really pales in comparison to the months outside of that space where we are educating our members about what we do. When we're having town halls and when we are sending out newsletters or just having conversations in our districts with persons that we know will then spread the word, it's the education process. I think one of the challenges we have with our American voting system is that all the emphasis is placed on the end of voting. We have the flyers, we have the commercials, we have the knocks on your door about get to the polls and vote. But then after the election, no one is talking about, to your point, the less than sexy thing of policy formulation. No one is talking about come down to the state capitol, the city council, or the U.S. Congress and watch the committee work as they deal with policy formulation. No one is talking about policy implementation either. No one's talking about the boring work, in some people's view, of the departments and agencies carrying out what was passed, right? No one then talks about that. And as a result, we miss the opportunity for policy modification, where the public can say, you know what, that bill that they passed and that they implemented isn't working in our community. Let me engage in the public comment period, right? And then help to get the bill changed next year. And that's partially on us because it can be very difficult to understand. But that's why we encourage people to do things like come down to the state capitol and have meetings with us, or come to our community meeting and have a conversation so we can explain in very plain language what is happening. For example, I have in my state house district an HBCU, Tennessee State University. It's a public land grant institution that has been in the news quite a bit the last few years.
Yeah, I've heard about it.
Just a little bit, right? And so what I've had to do the last year is go to the TSU Nashville Chapter Alumni Association meeting and explain what was happening with the bills, what was not going to be happening with the bills, and what the end result was hoped to be. I also had to spend time in some of those internet chat forums on Facebook and other social media avenues to explain to people what really happened and what it all meant. I took time out to go and have conversations with some people that I knew would carry the information back to a larger audience. And so that's what we do. You know, we engage that process. We help filter it down so people can understand it. And we do a good job of that, but we must do a better job because, again, I think the whole system itself is geared toward this exciting, explosive one bill that transforms everything instead of the incremental change that happen with a bill every year doing something great that people don't really view as sexy.
Well, you do have an advantage, obviously, with Tennessee State in that, obviously, you've been there twice for 2 degrees, and also as a product of an HBCU myself, I would argue that whether it's my alma mater, Morgan State, or even at Howard, that those who have attended them, they have a bit of an advantage. You will get their ear. Now, in your case, Representative, Pryor, you went to Indiana University. Mm-hmm. Do you hold as much sway there? Do you have the kind of for lack of a better term, respect that you feel that perhaps Representative Love has at TSU? Are they listening to you?
So I would say yes. I did attend Indiana University, and I'm very proud to be a Hoosier. I also have a great love for HBCUs as well, even though I did not attend them. But
there's still time. Go ahead.
I'm a little bit older. So
Yeah, there's never not enough. There's
That's
never not an opportunity to
That's
go back. And please continue.
I don't know, maybe an honorary degree, but I don't know that I want to go down the road of studying.
Yeah, I feel you there,
It
but
takes
please
a lot of
continue your
time.
point. Yeah.
And I try to do as much work as I can in my community for my constituents, but I appreciate the thought. But I work very closely with our universities as well. Even though I don't have any HBCUs in Indiana per se, we do have Martin University, which is a Black college in Indiana. But we have land grant institutions in Indiana as well, and I sit on Ways and Means, and those institutions have to come to Ways and Means to present their budget every year. And one of the things that we have consistently done as Black legislators is talk to the universities and make sure they are held accountable for their numbers as it relates to student enrollment, as it relates to minority business opportunities, and also as it relates to staffing and tenured professors. And so we make sure that we hold them accountable as well. And so I would say that yes, even though I'm not, I don't have HBCU in my community, and even though I went to Indiana University, it's not just Indiana University that has to be held accountable. It's all the universities that are state universities that have to be held accountable and make sure that they're enrolling minority students and making sure that they listen to us, and they do. I have regular meetings with the vice president of Indiana at Indiana University, as well as this coming week, I'm going to be at a dinner with the president of Indiana University. And the Black Caucus, we do meet regularly and hear from, as a Black Caucus, not just being a part of Ways and Means, but as a Black Caucus, hear from and have conversations with universities to let them know what our thoughts are, and to hear from them what they are doing as it relates to minority communities. So the voice is still there, even though I'm not the great state of Tennessee, the great state of Indiana, and we still hold it down in Indiana.
It's not too late. You can come to TSU, get a certificate.
I'll take that. I'll take that. Tennessee is right above Mississippi, and I was born and raised in Mississippi, so y'all still good.
I think that's a great way to end this conversation. Certainly, both of you and the organization has a lot of work ahead, but I appreciate you taking some time out. I hope to see both of you later on this week when I am participating in this conference as well. So again, thank you so very, very much. I appreciate your time.
Sir.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
That is the Daily Drum for this Tuesday, December 3rd. I'm Harold Fisher.